Hi, everyone. We are going to start in just a minute or two. Appreciate you all joining. Yeah, stay put for 1 or 2 minutes. All right. Yeah, I think we're going to get started. I thank you and hello everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or this morning from wherever you're joining us from. I am going to pass it to Brian Schlossnagel, who's going to introduce himself in the webinar, and we will get started.
Good afternoon. I am Brian Schlossnagel, a Program Environmental Clearance Officer at HUD, focused on disaster recovery. We appreciate you joining us today for our last installment of the Community Disaster Preparedness TA webinar series. In the aftermath of a disaster, Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery funds are typically one of the last federal resources allocated to a presidentially declared disaster and can be used as a supplemental resource for all other federal projects. Due to the timing, another federal agency could have completed the environmental review for the supplemented project already. To eliminate duplication of efforts and to expedite the recovery process to efficiently address the needs of the community, CDBG DR grantees and the associated responsible entity can adopt another federal agency's environmental review. This webinar outlines when an environmental review can be adopted and the process to do so. In addition, projects completed under certain sections of the Stafford Act have a unique streamlined adoption process. Our partners Enterprise and Arcadis will go in depth to distinguish between both adoption processes to ensure responsible entities have the resources needed to successfully fulfill their environmental responsibilities under Part 58 and ultimately expedite the community's recovery efforts. At this point, I'd like to hand it back over to Patrick Birdsong from Enterprise, who will be going over some of the housekeeping items for the webinar. Thank you again for joining today's presentation.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, so I'm Patrick Birdsong from Enterprise Community Partners, and joining me today are some folks from HUD and some folks from Arcadis. Our hosts this afternoon are going to be Seth Magden, the National Program Management Lead and Krista Jankowski, PhD, PG project planner, both from Arcadis. From our HUD team, we have a wealth of knowledge, including Brian, who we were just introduced to, Donna Mahone, who's a disaster recovery field environmental officer from HUD's New Jersey and Connecticut regional office, Josh Helms, who's a field environmental officer with HUD's Boston regional office. And thank you again for joining us. This, as Brian said, is the final webinar in our community disaster preparedness webinar series. The webinars that were preceding this webinar will be available on HUD Exchange soon. If you signed up for this webinar on HUD Exchange, you will get an email when this webinar is up on HUD Exchange, and at that time, the other webinars will be available as well. So, like I mentioned, this webinar is the final webinar in our series for community disaster preparedness. This webinar series was designed to help HUD grantees, stakeholders, and partners tackle disaster recovery, boost community resilience, and handle environmental reviews with more efficiency. Through this series, we were aiming to provide grantees with a solid grasp on the processes, regulations, and hurdles involved in disaster recovery, environmental reviews, and resilience, and then with knowledge and tools necessary to navigate the tricky environmental and historic preservation requirements like seasoned pros. So if that's of interest to you, I encourage you to check out the other webinars in our series as well. This is what we'll be going through today. Oops, I'm sorry. This table of contents gives you an idea of what we'll be covering today. The main objectives that we hope you take away from this webinar today are the environmental review roles and responsibilities under Entity 24 CFR Part 58, the process of adopting environmental reviews conducted by another federal agency under the Stafford Act, and the process of adopting environmental reviews conducted by another federal agency under 40 CFR 1506.3. Just a quick housekeeping note, the chat feature will be disabled for participants during the webinar, and we encourage you to send questions through the Q&A feature. All questions will either be responded to through the Q&A feature or live at the end of the presentation. We also encourage folks to share best practices with the group through the Q&A feature. And if after this webinar you have any additional questions, you can send them to Environmental Planning Division at hud.gov, and we will share that in the chat as well. So at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Seth, who is going to take us through the introduction to the environmental review adoption.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Certainly a lot of good material covered up to this point on the series, and thank you guys for tuning into this final installment here. So what we're going to do, as we've done before, is just do a little bit of table setting to help introduce everybody to the concept of environmental review adoption, understanding that there are folks coming into this that probably have a good bit of experience and hope you'll learn something new. And obviously there are also folks that are new to this process. And so we're gonna cover kind of some of the basics here up front. So on the next slide, we'll get into exactly what is environmental review adoption. And so I do want to draw your attention to a couple things as we go through. Be on the lookout for some best practices, and you're going to hear the term substantially the same scope of work repeated time and time again, and that's an important part of this. So really at a high level, environmental review adoption is about, as Brian mentioned at the front end, really streamlining this process to bring benefits to communities that we're serving in a more efficient and quicker manner, conserving those resources for actual projects where we can benefit from avoiding those duplications of efforts and working with partners at sister agencies and so forth to conduct the reviews that we need to conduct for our projects, right? And so again, at the very high level, what is environmental review adoption? So one agency has completed their environmental review, and so another agency that's considering substantially the same project scope can adopt that review, right? And so instead of starting from scratch, you're starting much further downrange and getting a jump on that. And so that's what we're going to get into. There are some different pathways associated with how you can do environmental review adoption. We'll get into those in the regulatory frameworks as well. And so one item to note here too, as well, there's that last bullet, thinking about a joint review. And this may seem a little bit familiar for some folks. Also, as we in an earlier session talked about unified federal review process, right? But looking at those opportunities to create and capitalize on work that's being done under another agency when we're looking at the same scope of work substantially. So on the next slide, we'll get into some key considerations that we want to look at. So the different types of reviews where HUD encourages adoptions: categorically excluded reviews, environmental assessments, and environmental impact statements. Important to note that that last one, the EIS review, that's very rare. So we're not going to go too deeply into that. We're basically looking at where you're going to be seeing a lot of potential for volume on adoption. And so that's just to note, much more the exception. But again, so thinking about, when other federal, state, tribal, or local agencies have already done environmental review for substantially the same scope of work, looking at how we can adopt that review with the projects that we're considering, and then fast tracking the recovery process. On the next slide, we will look at some of the framework here. So Section 109 of National Environmental Protection Act of 1969, and there through the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 allows for this pathway for categorical exclusions from other agencies. So just so you have a sense of, where this is at in the regs, and also so if you need to refer back to this in the future when you're using this as a resource, that link there, as we've done in all previous webinars, we have a lot of content linked here, so just recall that. But again, this is just providing that pathway for when one agency can review another agency's categorical exclusions and then formally adopt those themselves. So that's the Section 109 framework. And moving forward on the next slide, we will get into the two pathways that we're going to look at. And so pathway one, and this is the Stafford Act pathway. This is going to be your most common, and this is where we're going to talk a little bit about global match, flexible match, and the pathway that is most commonly used when you're running a matching program. And then we're also going to look at the second pathway when it's not necessarily the Stafford Act, and you're looking at another agency's review in full or in part. And so we'll go down both routes and provide you with insights on both. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, as part of the table setting, let's look at the basics of environmental review. So again, just zooming out, big picture, what is the environmental review process, right? It's understanding that the work that we're doing, and at a stage in the recovery process, which is often after other recovery efforts have begun, right? But thinking about the work that we're doing and undertaking and ensuring that, number one, there is compliance in place. Number two, not necessarily in that order of importance, but that we are looking at those potential environmental impacts and avoiding any additional impacts with the work that we're undertaking, and thinking about sensitive and protected resources. We're looking at how we can reduce any risks of impacts to the communities that we're trying to serve. And the do no harm approach, do no additional harm approach, right, in the communities that are already recovering. So thinking about any potentials for adverse environmental or health effects on end users through the programs and projects that we're undertaking. And on the next slide, a little bit more detail on why it's important. So this is not unique to HUD. Many of you have heard us say that before, but just reiterating, any federal funding that's being used requires environmental review. So it's mandatory, right, for any federally funded activities taking place, and that's through NEPA, and also outlined, and we're going to get into some of the HUD regs in a little bit more detail as well, a little bit further on. But this is, again, important upfront and part of the early plannings to be able to look downrange at your recovery portfolio and projects, and understand where you can identify and address any of those potential environmental risks early in the cycle, so you can figure out the pathways and not delay the delivery of those projects. Again, this is about starting early in the process, forecasting forward, understanding who the right partners are, where you're going to find the right information for when you may pursue environmental review adoption. Again, this is also about stewardship of public funds, right? So any dollars that are saved on the environmental review process are dollars that can be applied towards other recovery projects, right? And so we're looking at those efficiencies across the portfolio about where we can save money on some of the administrative processes and deploy those funds elsewhere. So being good stewards of public funds. And again, we are serving the communities that we live in and that we work in. And so ensuring that there's transparency, with those stakeholders and the general public. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as well, where environmental review adoption also doesn't necessarily require you to do publication or do public comment periods if you're adopting another agency's review. So there are some efficiencies in that regard as well. On the next slide, we will just at a high level, you're going to get, as I mentioned, understanding of roles, responsibilities of the responsible entity under the HUD regs. You're going to look at the process of how to adopt environmental reviews under the different pathways mentioned. And then we're going to look at some HUD specific regulations that may require supplemental information to demonstrate compliance. And this is, again, designed to help you as the grantees run a more efficient and streamlined process and apply resources in the most important places to help deliver those benefits to your communities. So at this point, I will hand it over to my colleague, Krista Jankowski.
Thanks, Seth. Today I will be speaking to you about particular environmental review requirements as outlined in the HUD regulations listed here. So 24 CFR parts 51, 55, and 58. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to be presenting is an overview of some of the key regulations, including 24 CFR 58, which is providing guidance for the responsible entities and how they should be conducting environmental reviews for their HUD-assisted projects. Part 58 outlines the responsibilities of the RE, and again, including that they're ensuring compliance with NEPA and as well as any other relevant laws and regulations and authorities, and we're going to enumerate those in a few slides. Other key regulations for HUD-assisted projects to be aware of are under Part 51, which is focused on HUD-specific environmental standards, and then also Part 55, which looks specifically at standards around floodplain management and wetland protections. And both of those we'll go into more detail about later in the presentation. But for now, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. And we're going to start here with touching on some specifics regarding the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, for which responsible entities are responsible to ensure compliance under Part 58. So NEPA was established to require federal agencies to assess and consider the environmental impacts of a project before undertaking those major projects. Best practices relate to meeting this requirement, including considering proposed actions early on in the planning process and doing so with those NEPA regulations in mind. And it's also an important part of environmental review in that it supports environmentally responsible decision-making that involves public participation. So with regard to environmental review adoption, the law specifically indicates that agencies should work together and adopt each other's reviews when it's appropriate. And this, again, can help to expedite the completion of the environmental review record for a project, and then that in turn can allow quicker timelines for HUD funds to be committed, obligated, or expended to actually help communities. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, where we'll start our look at the variety of different environmental laws and authorities which require compliance to obtain a completed environmental review record and to have that project move to implementation. On this slide, we just wanted to note that there are a number of laws and authorities, including the Clean Air Act or National Historic Preservation Act, just to name a few. Following this presentation, as was mentioned, these slides and recording will be available for you. And so you'll be able to click on the links here and access additional information about each of these and get guidance to help you in looking at each of these laws and authorities, understanding and ensuring compliance with them. On the next slide, we are going to look at some additional specific laws that are addressed under 24 CFR 58.6. So in addition to the number of laws and authorities on the previous slide, this regulation requires that HUD-assisted projects are shown to be compliant with these three specific regulations. So that's the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP. So with that, per the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973, it's required that all properties be covered by flood insurance if they're receiving federal assistance, such as HUD-supported properties, or if they're located in a special flood hazard area, or SFHA. And then beyond that, also compliance is needed with the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, which is aiming to remove incentives for development in certain coastal areas, as well as the airport runway clear zones, and make sure that the siting of those projects is in compliance there. So, and it is important to note that for all projects, regardless of the level of review, these are going to be required for to show compliance with those. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we're going to shift gears just a little bit and look at the responsibilities of the responsible entity as laid out under Part 58. So on the next slide, we will look at an overview of those responsibilities. And so when the RE is acting as a designee to complete the environmental review, they have a number of different responsibilities and requirements, including becoming the responsible federal official for NEPA responsibilities. The RE is the one responsible for evaluating environmental reviews, including the scope and the content, and for making the environmental finding. And they are the entity that will be accountable for the content of that environmental review. And so that's at a high level, but on the next slide, we can see some additional details. First, we can define the assumption authority that is granted under 24 CFR Part 58.4. And so assumption authority is a term we made here, and it really is just a regulation that states that the responsible entities shall assume the responsibility for the environmental review, decision-making, and the actions that would otherwise apply to HUD under NEPA or other provisions of law. And so that is going to apply in programs such as the Community Disaster or Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery and others where the responsible entity is acting as HUD in performing the environmental review. So under Part 58, again, the RE is responsible for the scope and content, and it is important to note that the responsible entity is usually specified within the notice of funding availability, the program regulations, or the legislation, and that that entity, while being responsible for that work, is able to use contractors to help develop the environmental review record. However, regardless of whether there is the use of contractors or not, the responsible entity has the ultimate responsibility for reviewing all of the content, for performing the consultation, and to make the determinations that are applying to the environmental review record. So that still lies with the responsible entity, not the contracted partners. Next slide, please. Here we just have a few notes on considerations related to the timing of when funds for a project can be spent or otherwise obligated. The responsible entity must have a completed environmental review record for a project before funds can be committed, obligated, or expended. And so that includes when adopting an environmental review from another agency, all of the laws and authorities have to be shown to be in compliance, and whether that's through an independent environmental review or through adopting, that still needs to happen before the RE can submit a request for release of funds if necessary, and certify that compliance. So after HUD does approve that, then the dollars can be used to move that project forward. But that environmental review adoption is just one way that the responsible entity could maybe streamline efforts and possibly significantly speed up the timelines to get to project implementation more quickly. And then also on this slide, just want to make a note that responsible entities also need to be aware of choice limiting actions that could impact the spending of HUD funds. So prior to that completion of the ERR, actions like acquiring property or beginning the physical work on a project can cause noncompliance and should definitely be avoided. And one thing to note, however, is that under 24 CFR 58.47, if the same responsible entity that conducted the original environmental review approves supplemental assistance, such as insurance or guarantees for a project that was previously approved, that reevaluation of the environmental findings would not be required in such a case. So this provision does simplify the process for certain projects, but if you have questions on timing and when funds can be expended or obligated, those are definitely things to check in with and make sure that you're following that guidance. On the next slide, we can look at some of the responsibilities or the role of HUD in this process that don't lie with the responsible entity. So HUD is still involved when a responsible entity is conducting an environmental review in a number of ways, including receiving the request for release of funds to certify that the environmental review is complete, accepting public comments when there is an applicable objection period, and then also monitoring, providing technical assistance in all of those different functions that HUD does provide during the environmental review process and moving the project to implementation. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Seth to discuss with you more about the environmental review process.
Thanks very much, Krista. So at this point, we're going to take a look at the process from a high level and then the different levels of review and where adoption makes sense and then other areas where it doesn't. So on the next slide is just a kind of a quick overview or snapshot of what the different levels are. And so looking at initially, of course, defining the project and understanding what the level of review is, and we'll look at those different levels of review. And then when you are looking at performing the environmental review, right, is that the right spot to look at environmental review adoption, right? And so thinking about when you're defining the project, even before that, typically, when you have an allocation, you're defining your programs, doing program design, your action plan, you're considering a match program. Many folks on this call probably are running match programs, and so this is going to sound similar to things you've heard before, which is good, right? And so we're going to get a little bit more into that also about where those matching programs with respect to HMGP, FEMA PA, and so forth are taking place a little bit downrange, but looking here at the overall process, right, where adoption slots into the different sequence of events, and it's at that third step. And on the next slide, we're going to look at some of the levels of review, right? And so environmental review adoption doesn't make sense for every level of review, right? So if you see on that first line there for projects that are exempt from review, and it's going to take you less than an hour, in theory, it should take you less than an hour, right? So it doesn't make sense to pursue adoption. It's going to take you more time to package all the adoption and so forth than just going ahead and taking care of what you need to do on that side. So the main areas where we're considering environmental review adoption is with the categorically excluded subject to the CEST, right? And then the environmental assessment level of review as well. So the categorically excluded not subject to, again, that's a lower lift. It wouldn't make as much sense there. And then as mentioned earlier, with environmental impact statement level of review, very rare. And that if you find yourself in that situation, that's a good time to reach out to your REO there as you're looking at a level of review that is a little more significant in nature. And so again, environmental review adoption, considering when you are defining that level of review that's needed, when it's appropriate, when it's not. And this is also the time when you're thinking about your matching programs and where it's most commonly going to be applied, which we'll get into those pathways in a few slides. So on the next slide, let's take a look at thinking about how each of the federal agencies has their own mission. And this is part of the framing that we have introduced here from the beginning of the series, right? So when HUD funds are the last funds to arrive on the scene and their supplemental funds, right, any other federal agency that has been involved with a project that has substantially the same scope of work, they're going to have their own mission, their own requirements that they have to follow. So those may be different from what HUD is considering as exempt and categorically excluded. So there has to be that alignment there. And so with this in mind, there may be the need to elevate the level of review to environmental assessment if that other agency's review does not meet the standards within those criteria there, or those citations. So thinking about exempt activities, thinking about categorical exclusions, and then environmental assessment. So that is when you may need to elevate, right? If there is a difference with that initial agency's environmental review in what you are required to do as a responsible entity. So if that elevation is occurring, it's under what Chris is going to go over in a little bit with that pathway 2. But if it's under the Stafford Act, what we're calling pathway 1 here in this presentation, that elevation isn't necessary if it's an adoption under the Stafford Act, or the project is being undertaken with agency under the Stafford Act. And that's usually FEMA with the global match and flexible match type of approach. So on the next slide, we will get into pathway 1. So this is where we're going to talk about environmental review adoption under the most common route where grantees are using environmental review adoption for efficiency. And so on the next slide, we will just provide a little background here. So again, this is something that probably many of you have, I would say, a strong degree of familiarity with the Stafford Act. For some, it may just be a passing citation, but just a little bit of background here. The Stafford Act is the foundation for a lot of the work that we do, and it defines how federal agencies are going to provide a response and recovery assistance after a disaster. It outlines how a presidential disaster declaration is issued, and this is also the process wherein grantees and subrecipients and so forth are requesting that assistance, or how that assistance request trickles up. And so this is also setting the conditions for obtaining that assistance. So the Stafford Act is a big part of the work that we do across, not just with respect to environmental review adoption, but it plays a part in a lot of the work that we do in community development. So on the next slide, looking at HUD's consolidated notice here for community development block grant for disaster recovery. And this is the pathway that is then providing, that HUD's providing for grantees to adopt that environmental review from another agency. And so this, just backing up to post Sandy, right? This is where we're looking at that Disaster Relief Appropriations Act in the framing there, when it was recognized that there's a huge opportunity for efficiency. And so how HUD assistance is coming in a little bit later in the process, and how that assistance is supplementing projects that may be considered or underway under the Stafford Act. The very specific sections there of the Stafford Act, and the two most common that you'll probably be exposed to is the Section 404 and 406, right? In the hazard mitigation program, that's where we hear the term global match. In Section 406, with respect to FEMA PA, that's where we hear the term flexible match. And so these are the two most common opportunities for environmental review adoption under the Stafford Act. And on the next slide, thinking about what the requirements are here, right? And so again, this is where the grantee is providing that supplemental assistance to any of those actions that are performed under the Stafford Act, right? And this is the cost share, the local match. And this is very, very frequently the case, right? As the HUD funding is the last funding to come in, but frequently local government subrecipient entities don't necessarily have the cash resources, in particular in a post-disaster situation. So looking to where that HUD funding can provide that supplemental assistance to cover that local match. This is where the HUD funding comes in. And so just noting there again that this is a hyperlink for future reference. You'll also see the big check mark there when it's a good option for you as a responsible entity, as the grantee, to introduce a best practice or have a memo to file, right? And this is where, again, hammering on that substantially the same scope of work, important to ensure that is documented and put that in the file. And so this is one of those opportunities where we like to say the file speaks for itself. Any reviewer that comes to look at it, right, and is able to follow the process of the initial review. So again, just pay attention to that check mark as you see those throughout, and looking here also at when reviews do not need to be supplemented, right? We're looking at 24 CFR Part 51 with environmental criteria and standards, Part 55 with floodplain management and protection of wetlands, and then Part 58, right, which is inclusive of the others. And we're going to get more into those in detail. And on the next slide, the process of adoption here. And so this is typically quick, and those 3 steps there at the top. This is just at a high level the process that you're going to work through. And so the responsible entity is keeping that FEMA review on file and maintaining that close coordination. Following that, the responsible entity can submit the request for release of funds and certification, and then HUD will issue the authority to use those funds, right? And so in this process, the Secretary of HUD may approve funds that are subject to these adoption provisions or that are categorically excluded. And so the state, when acting as HUD as a responsible entity, can also approve that authority to use grant funds. So again, this is thinking about Pathway 1, Stafford Act matching programs, right? The whole idea of this is to streamline the recovery process, to get that local match covered, to support subrecipients to be able to move forward with their recovery projects. And so that is the idea here with respect to the Stafford Act. It is creating that pathway. One thing to note here also, just that last bullet, that the responsible entity is responsible and must ensure that any mitigation measure that's identified in the other agency's review, that those are also documented. And that's another opportunity for a memo to file there for future potential audits, monitorings, reviews, et cetera, to ensure that that file is speaking for itself. And on the next slide, the process here, and again, hyperlink there with the FAQ document, which has a lot of good information on it, right? So the responsible entity, the documentation that must be included, right, is what is the other federal agency's review that's being adopted. This is essentially, just the basics, right? The name of that federal agency, the name of the project, ensuring that there's alignment. So there, if the project is called one thing under another proposal, for example, and then calling it something different, ensure everything aligns as best as possible so that review process is streamlined. And so any future review of that file, everything is synced up. So one note here too, if there are a number of sites or projects that are part of an environmental review adoption, instead of submitting every environmental review record on its own, if there's an opportunity for an efficiency to attach a spreadsheet with the relevant data points when it's the same process and same type of work that's being followed throughout, that's an efficiency there, as opposed to creating a number of individual records when you can kind of do a bulk record that's attached with multiple lines on a spreadsheet, for example, is a good opportunity to consider another efficiency there. And on the next slide, this is just to bring it all home, and we're not going to go through this, understanding this is probably hard for a lot of folks to see, but this is just essentially the workflow of everything we've talked through up to the present, just kind of a snapshot all here in one slide. So the grantee, initially you're going to get that FEMA record, right, and you're going to conduct that analysis, understand what it applies to under the Stafford Act, and then there's the series of yes, no, and if it's substantially the same scope, how you move forward, right? So this may be a good single slide if you want to print it out and set it on the side of your desk as a good reference point. But this is HUD's workflow here, that it is part of their lexicon of resources. So just note that this is a good kind of single snapshot that kind of brings all together the different pieces that we've talked about here up to the present. And at this stage, I'm going to hand it over to Krista to talk about Pathway 2.
Thanks, Seth. All right, so now we are going to start moving into talking about the other pathway for environmental review adoption. In this case, adoption in full or in part when not done under the Stafford Act. So next slide, please. So environmental review adoption has so many potential benefits for moving the environmental review process forward more efficiently for the responsible entity and then therefore for the beneficiary. So in fact, many of the laws and authorities that require compliance during the environmental review period specifically outline that adoption is allowed and encourages that coordination across agencies. So therefore, we do want to be sure to outline this other pathway for environmental review that's not under the Stafford Act so that it's being able to be taken whenever it is appropriate. So these for these reviews, responsible entities may adopt the environmental review from a number of different entities, and that could be another HUD office, another responsible entity, or a federal agency. And this can be done for any level of review. And there can also be adoption of a final environmental assessment or categorical exclusion determination when appropriate. And we've kind of touched on that. During this process, the responsible entity is responsible for supplementing any adopted review materials that are received from another agency with any additional HUD requirements that are necessary for a completed environmental review record under HUD's regulations. So next slide. So here we're going to look at some of those requirements to adopt an environmental review from another agency in full. So the first and key requirement, which may sound familiar at this point, is that the project for which the review is being adopted must have substantially the same scope as the project for which the other agency's review was conducted. So this means if the HUD-assisted project is focused on repairs to housing, the adopted review needs to be from a project similar enough. And the review can't be adopted from a project that, for instance, is focusing on acquiring properties or something that doesn't have that similarity that the environmental review record would still be valid for. Additionally, when that review adoption is occurring not under the Stafford Act, the reviews adopted from the other agencies are still subject to the HUD-specific requirements that we've mentioned earlier in this presentation. So in order to fulfill this requirement, the responsible entity may need to supplement the adopted review with additional consultation. On the next slide, we can see that the specific responsibilities for the responsible entity under Part 58 when adopting another agency's review in full include a number of responsibilities that we've already touched on in this presentation and some that we haven't yet discussed, including reviewing the environmental review that the other agency has completed and making sure that the review meets the criteria for adoption, confirming the project scope, and then also, the responsible entity should maintain regular communication with the agency that conducted the original review, and that can just facilitate information sharing and making sure that all of the relevant information is getting to where it needs to be and being documented. The responsible entity is also needing to document that the project complies with all the related laws and authorities, just as they would under any environmental review that has to happen with the adoption. And that's whether that's through the original review or through the supplementation for those HUD-specific regs. And then also the responsible entity is responsible for ensuring that any identified mitigation actions are implemented and documenting which agency is leading on those mitigation actions as well. So once all of that is finished and there is the completion of the request for the release of funds, then there will be a certified environmental review record once that has been approved. So it's important to note that at this point in the process, when adopting the environmental review in this manner, when it's not under the Stafford Act, the publication, public comment period, objection period, all of those will still apply and should be accounted for in your implementation and review timelines. Next slide, please. Here we are wanting to note some things to keep in mind regarding the level of review for a project and how that determination by HUD or another agency could impact the environmental review adoption process. So first, it's important to know that when adopting in full, that the responsible entities can generally adopt the agency's level of review determination. There are some exceptions to this, so the responsible entity will need to confirm that it's appropriate to do so. For instance, in cases where another agency makes that categorically excluded determination and that doesn't align with HUD's categorical exceptions, there will have to be the review will have to be processed as an environmental assessment, which will require that adoption. And then those will need to be published in accordance with HUD's publication schedule, as well as all the other relevant regulations. And additionally, when adopting an environmental review in full from another agency, the responsible entity should notify any parties that were involved in consultation for the original review with the other agency. So the consulting parties should be notified that the adoption is being pursued, and that the responsible entity should confirm that the project covers substantially, again, the same scope, and that the identified mitigation will be verified and implemented. So, for example, for a Section 106 review involving historic properties, the responsible entity should notify, say, the State Historic Preservation Officer or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer on tribal lands of the adoption, and keep that conversation going to make sure everyone is notified and aware of what's going on as a consulting party. All right, and on the next slide, we also just want to touch on the process of adopting another agency's review in part. So this is pretty similar to adopting the process of adopting a environmental review in full, but only when it applicable to portions of the original review. So adoption in part really occurs when adoption in full is not appropriate, but the responsible entity could still find benefit from partial adoption. So in cases where a project description changes substantially, or if there's significant change to environmental conditions that would impact the project, and render it so that not all of the documents and all of the components of that original review are still applicable, then an adoption in full might make sense. And so individual elements of that original review could be adopted into a new environmental review record in those cases, and that would just be prepared following normal procedures under 24 CFR Part 58. When undertaking an adoption in part, the responsible entity has to review the original review conducted by the other agency and incorporate only those documents that are still valid and relevant to the current proposal. And so, as with all aspects of environmental review, whether there's an environmental review adoption taking place or not, it is crucial for the responsible entity to maintain clear and accurate documentation of the process and all associated materials, just to ensure that you can clearly indicate what has been done and what remains to be done, and have all of the pieces in place to get that completed environmental review record. All right, next slide. So this is just to highlight that one way of incorporating environmental reviews from another agency is incorporation by reference. And it has a specific application with regard to environmental reviews in that if there's information that still remains valid in NEPA documentation or other publicly available material, it can just be included by reference in an environmental review without needing the responsible entity to duplicate the review or redo a consultation or things like that. So it continues that theme of streamlining the process. All right, so we can go on to the next slide. And here we're just going to move into talking about additional key HUD specific regulations that are required for a complete environmental review record. And when you're completing that environmental review adoption not under the Stafford Act, these are regs that you will still need to keep in mind and may require the development of supplemental documentation in order to have that completed environmental review record. Next slide, please. So the environmental criteria and standards that the responsible entity must demonstrate compliance with under 24 CFR Part 51, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, are laid out here on the slide. Again, I want to draw your attention to the fact that each of these has a link provided to direct you to more information about each of these in particular. But again, unlike when adopting an environmental review under the Stafford Act, under this pathway, the RE must supplement with the other agency's environmental review record with these HUD-specific requirements on noise abatement, explosive and thermal materials, and runway clear zones. And so really thinking about where the siting of that project is and how it may be impacted by these HUD regulations. Next slide, please. And when you are, as an RE, adopting environmental review from another agency, it's also important to note that 24 CFR Part 55 allows for the adoption of that agency's floodplain management and wetlands protection review. There are some nuances to that, so there can't be any pending litigation related to the regulation, and the RE again has to confirm, so those key elements of the project, the scope of work, and that the information is still valid in order to adopt the other agency's review on these. And it is also very important to note that not all agencies have the same review requirements, or they're not all equally stringent across all agencies. So the responsible entity is responsible for confirming that the review being adopted is suitably stringent or meets the requirements that HUD has for these laws and authorities. And then we have one more consideration to look at on the next slide, which is 24 CFR Part 50 8.5, which provides that as part of the environmental review, multifamily and non-residential properties must have an evaluation of previous uses of the site, and the responsible entity must evaluate other evidence of contamination on or near the site in order to avoid adverse effects to occupants. And there's a link here to documentation on HUD's recent policy update to include radon as a gas that must be considered in that contamination analysis. And so that link will direct you to more details on that. But in the end, it's really important for the RE to note that HUD regulations require different levels of toxic waste review depending on whether the proposed project is for a single family or a multifamily or non-residential property. And so again, as with many of these things, it's the responsibility of the RE to ensure compliance with the correct requirements for that particular project. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and let Seth take back over to wrap up the last portion.
Thanks, Krista. And so bring it all home, and you've heard many times throughout, just in terms of memos to file and documenting things. And so we'll look at the kind of critical pieces and how you implement adoptions. And so on the next slide is really just that snapshot of what's included, right? What are the ingredients for documenting your adoptions? And so every environmental review record, right, has to include this documentation that's signed or certified by the responsible entity. And a big part of that is documenting that substantially the same scope, right? So that is a key part of that documentation. Another part, obviously, is that if you are adopting another agency's review, that there is that level of record of informing that other agency that their adoption is going to be, or that their review is going to be adopted. And then if there are any new mitigation measures or conditions that are being introduced to the project, that those are also flagged for that, or the origin agency, so to speak, or the originating entity of that environmental review. And so providing that level of communication and also including that in your documentation is the best practice. So overall, though, the documentation for your environmental review adoptions needs to show how you're complying with all the required laws and authorities, right? And so that is a key component, right? The original environmental review is being cited with whatever sort of unique identifiers, or the agency that was the name of the agency mentioned on the prior slides. What all is included in that original environmental review, and ensuring that that is in your documentation as well, showing how the scope was evaluated and is substantially the same. Again, this is the key to this being a successful environmental review adoption. In streamlining the process is ensuring that the scopes are the same, and that is documented as part of the file. And then also looking at any of the other special conditions or mitigation measures that may be introduced based upon differences in regulatory requirements, right? Where those are being flagged, and that also, again, that information is being provided back to the original agency as well, if there are any special conditions or mitigation measures. And mentioned before, if this is an environmental review adoption that reaches that environmental impact statement level of review, that is a good time for you to reach out to your REO or FEO for additional support in terms of how you want to ensure that you have the right documentation if it gets to that level. And on the next slide, just bringing it all home here, right? Again, the goal of this webinar today and this entire series is how do we do our jobs more efficiently to deliver benefits to the communities, to conserve resources. So today, this adoption process is showing you how to streamline that. The Stafford Act pathway, number one, other agencies, pathway number two. Your most common one's going to be Stafford Act. So thinking about with your matching programs, how to streamline that process, how you can bring that completed review from another agency and start at a further point down the sequence of the recovery process. Again, kind of that kickstart approach. And then thinking about, at the very earliest stage possible, how do you plan for this? Whether that's in the early program design, action plan development stage, or if your action plan has already been published and you're considering an action plan amendment, maybe that's a time to think about how you get your right stakeholders together and coordinate data sharing. But a big part of this is thinking about who the right stakeholders are at your sister agencies, and ensuring that you have access to the data and that you have open lines of communication. The memo to file approach and documenting everything that you're doing and letting that file speak for itself to ensure compliance, and making sure that everything is there, that you have documented every aspect of that adoption. So overall, again, the idea is to shorten the recovery timeline and to get benefits to the communities that are waiting for projects to be delivered and that need those recovery activities to support their holistic community recovery. And so on the next slide, we're going to get into some of the additional resources, and I'm going to hand it back over to Patrick.
Thank you, Seth. Yeah, so just a few additional resources that could be beneficial to you as you are going through this process, in addition to this presentation, are listed here. And when this presentation is up on HUD Exchange, as we've mentioned before, you'll be able to click on these links and they'll take you where they need to take you. So moving on now, we only have a few minutes for question and answer, but we can definitely use that time wisely. A few questions have come in through the chat, and then we have a few other here as well. Just quickly, yes, the slides will be posted on HUD Exchange. You'll receive an email when those slides have been posted to HUD Exchange. So thinking about some questions here, let's see, maybe this is a good one for Brian. How do you determine the level of review needed when there are multiple activities being undertaken? Does it require multiple levels of environmental review?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Patrick. Overall, it's a very similar process that you would actually go through for any other environmental review. You would want to take an aggregation of all the project activities and then go back to 58.34 to 58.37 to evaluate that scope of work to see how it matches up to those different activities, to determine if the environmental review level is exempt, CNST, CST, environmental assessment, or environmental impact statement.
Perfect. Thank you, Brian. I think this is a good question for Josh. How do you go about informing the agency that prepared the original environmental review that you intend to adopt their environmental review? And what are some ways to deal with difficulties in getting that environmental review when communication can be strained?
Thanks. And this is something that certainly isn't uncommon with the straining part, but I'll start with how you actually go through that process. And really establishing a relationship with another federal agency and with FEMA before a disaster starts is really a good way. So you can establish procedures, whether it's just a written procedure or a memorandum of understanding as to how you will handle coordination during a disaster is really a good starting point. And that's through the Regional Unified Federal Review Coordinator at FEMA. You can also work with HUD to help find those coordination pathways. So working with your regional environmental officer, working with your field environmental officer, and working at the disaster level. So those are really good ways to start that process. When you're on a disaster, one way to handle that is also to just go to the org chart and to see who at FEMA can help with that. There should be a Unified Federal Review Advisor on staff for there. So I think that's a good way to go about it, and especially, again, the importance of making that relationship beforehand is that when a disaster happens, there's really a frenzy. So people are busy and it's tougher to get a hold of people. Thanks.
Thank you, Josh. This looks like a good question for Brian again. Is it possible to use heroes for the reviews that are adopted under the Stafford Act?
You can. Unfortunately, Heroes doesn't have a good toggle or indicator for adoption, especially underneath the Stafford Act presently. But as you're going through and completing your package for your environmental review, you can take what you have gathered through FEMA's REC and other other documentation as well, and put that into the appropriate sections for the different laws and authorities, and make reference that you are adopting FEMA's environmental review. Chris also mentioned that there are a couple different unique HUD requirements that do not have to be further supplemented underneath the Stafford Act. So it's important once you get to those particular items that you justify the reason for that. Also, it's important to ensure that you have a memo to file in your HEROES environmental review record, that you have reviewed the scope of work, and ensure that it's substantially the same, identified the appropriate Stafford Act section that you are adopting the environmental review under. So not quite as straightforward, but you can still piece things together as you would for other environmental reviews.
Thank you, Brian. So just in the interest of time, we're going to move forward, but what we'll do is all of the questions that were not answered but were asked, we will provide a document that has the answers to these questions. When this webinar goes up on HUD Exchange, you can access that as well. And then if you have any questions in the meantime, you can always send them to Environmental Planning Division at HUD.gov. So as I mentioned before, all of these webinars will be up on HUD Exchange sometime soon. This is the last webinar in our Community Disaster Preparedness webinar series. And so if you have joined us for the previous webinars, just wanted to say thank you. And if you haven't, thank you for joining this one. And these resources will be available to you shortly. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. I hope that this was informative and provided you with some guidance as you're going through your environmental review processes. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day.